Hi, welcome to Romance Writers Therapy. This week we've got Shoshana Rain as our guest author, and she's here to tell us about her third book, The Desert Heiress. Oh my god, of course I've seen it a million times this week.
I would hope so.
No, you're doing a great job. Like every time you've released a book, you have done such a spectacular job, in my opinion, of like really getting a consistent posting schedule and getting people to see your book is out there.
That's definitely the hardest part of the whole thing. So I try to make it as easy as on myself as possible. Pre-made templates, as many pull quotes as I can convince other people to give me because I hate finding them myself. And just post.
The pull quotes is such a real like dilemma because it's like the line that you think is hot or you think is funny, and then you're like, but does anybody else think this is a good line? you
Oh
know?
yeah, no, those things never ever line up. The lines that I pick personally are ones that the readers have completely ignored, and the ones that I had absolutely no interest in are the ones that they've kind of like zoomed in on. And I'm just like, are we reading the same book? I thought I was laying down good clues for you all.
Oh my god.
It's great though. I love seeing what they find.
Oh, absolutely. Do you ever do like you go into the most highlighted quotes in the Kindle app?
All the time. I love looking at those. And honestly, they give me some great promo ideas. So it makes me really excited to dig through them.
Absolutely. Like sometimes I forget that I liked a line until I find it in the popular highlights, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, all right, time to make a graphic.
Exactly.
So this is the third book you've written, The Desert Heiress.
Right.
Your first two books had a very, what is the word for it? Hellenic pantheon? Greek pantheon?
Yes. Hellenic or Greek pantheon, either works.
Okay.
The Desert Heiress is a second world. I would call it a lower fantasy because it's not heavy on the magic. It's heavy on political intrigue, but it is a second world fantasy, which means a fresh, brand new world that I have created. I liken it to a setting like the American Southwest, which is where I grew up, but with a political and social structure that is kind of akin to the Roman Empire if it had survived up on through the Industrial Revolution.
Ooh, okay. I dig it. I dig it. Do you Okay, sorry. We do a lot of spin-offs on this show, like not spin-offs, little tangents on this show. And so like the moment you said Roman Empire and like Second World Fantasy, my mind was like, oh, have you played Skyrim?
Yes, actually, I've been playing so much Skyrim the last few weeks. It was one of my big detox from writing games.
Hmm.
I tend to cycle through games, and to be fair, I play the same ones over and over again. So
Oh, big
after
mood.
while I was writing, it was playing Stardew Valley because I needed something with the chillest possible vibes ever that I could just lose myself in and relax from. And then once I had finished, I had the innate urge to become a stealth archer and kill a whole bunch of random stuff all over Skyrim. So that's what happened.
God, the stealth archer build is like so addicting. Like every time I think I'm gonna make another build, I'm like, actually, let's like slip back into that Dark Brotherhood armor.
Right. I don't even lie to myself anymore. It's always going to be the same. It's going to be Stealth Archer. It's going to be Thieves Guild first. That's just how it's going to work out every single time. But apparently there's like a mod you can download that will automatically kill you if you draw a bow while you're in a stealth position,
Oh my
preventing you
god.
from playing as a Stealth Archer.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I was just like, I feel so attacked by this particular mod's existence.
Yeah, targeted. Okay, so sorry I got on a little tangent just because like my brain just immediately went there. All right, so what made you choose Roman, like the Roman Empire?
I've studied it a fair amount through college. I was a history major, mostly focused on American history, but I've done a lot of ancient civs too. And I really wanted a structure that wasn't the same sort of monarchy based kingdom sort of thing. So falling into the Roman Empire was kind of the next logical choice. I just also wanted something that I thought could work with a sort of shipping company mercantilist sort of setup that I had for the book as well. And I thought those kind of married well together. And I kind of had this grandiose image of Carthage and Rome fighting each other when I imagined the province of Lesser Senephra against the rest of the Seven Star Empire. That was kind of the idea I had, only it not ending with Lesser Senephra being salted and wiped off the face of the earth, of course.
So in the Desert Heiress, Lise has, am I saying it right? Is it
Yeah,
Lise or Liz? Or okay.
it's Lise.
Okay. So she has three sort of love interests, as I understand it.
Yes, it is a wide choose. So she has three. I've been calling it enemies to lovers, but it's probably closer to reluctant allies and mafia rivals as love interests. Because the setup is that Lisa is the heiress to a dead criminal empire. 100 years ago, her family ran the illegal smuggling operation that was in Port Senephra, the city where it's set. They took a fall, and since then, all her family's really been able to do is advise the other factions of this underground organization. And when she gets to power, she's like, "I'm done with this. I want back what my family had 100 years ago," and it goes from there.
I like the mafia framing of it because I feel like when we say enemies to lovers, like it kind of does conjure this kind of very everyday almost, not like huge power struggles between like actual people who have like a lot of power, but like, the more mundane kind of struggle. Does that make sense? Is that just like a weird
I
uh
think it's more of a genre consideration. I think like enemies to lovers is a trope that, of course, goes through all the
you can use
various.
it for anything, yeah.
You can use it really for anything, but I think when you get into fantasy romance or sci-fi romance, it starts to take on a different level, I think, than it would in, let's say, a straight contemporary romance.
Hmm.
Um, because I mean, this is my general feelings. Knife to the throat is a crime in contemporary romance, but it's hot in fantasy
Absolutely.
romance. But yeah, it just takes on a very different flavor when the stakes are, I don't want to say higher because I mean, contemporary can bring some pretty high stakes, but they're usually not,
They're usually not like that kind of violent. Yeah.
yeah. And the genre expectations involved means you get to have a lot more darker content, which means I think you can take the enemies to lovers trope a little farther than you could in contemporary romance. I'm of course not including dark romance in there because that's very much its own thing, but fantasy romance definitely has its own expectations of what enemies to lovers should be. Then I think
Yeah.
versus like contemporary.
The further you get, I think, from contemporary romance, because I talk with Marty a lot about this in because like I love reading Regency romance. It's like, and it's always like the things I will accept in like any historical is so different from like what I will accept in a contemporary as far as like boundaries and like all those things.
Oh,
So I
for
think like
sure.
literally any distance you put between yourself and the real world, it's like, all right, now all stakes are so much higher.
Yeah, and just what you're willing to accept as something that is forgivable from a character, I think also just totally changes the farther you are from our accepted current reality.
Absolutely. He can commit war crimes, but he can't in a contemporary romance.
Exactly. No war crimes in contemporary romance. That
No,
would be
that
bad.
All right. So this is your third book, and we like to talk about the processes of like what it means to write each book, like what feeling different skills kind of like become more pronounced, what seems like to be more of a struggle each time around. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on like what this book was like for you to write as compared to your first two.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I would say The Desert Heiress is a very, very different book from Stripes Apple or Oblivion's River, which are the two books in the New Olympus series. For one thing, like I said, they're second world fantasy. For another thing, they are first person past versus first person present. So I did a huge tonal and tense shift from these books. They have a very different voice and style, which my copy editor gave me some flack about. She's like, why did you change your whole voice for this story? And I'm like, because the voice of the story changed. I don't know precisely what you want from me. But it was very much a different exercise. I mean, Stripes Apple is probably closest to urban fantasy if I had to really frame it in terms of a genre, even though it doesn't quite fit. All of my books are weird. They don't ever quite fit where they should. It has that sort of tonal feeling. It's grittier, it's more immediate. It's definitely not as flowery in, well, I don't know if flowery is the right word. It's more gothic in the Desert Heiress, I think, than Stripes Apple. But Stripes Apple is very much a modern work. It's very much a modern feel, modern everything. Um, so it was just a very, very different setup to change that entire writing style. On top of which, my world building was a lot more me making stuff up. I drew on a lot of real life sources and other inspirations, but unlike with Greek mythology, where I was researching a lot and drawing on established written sources, the Desert Heiress had a lot of things in my hand, so I had to build the government structures. I had to build the religions. I had to build everything basically from scratch and how this world was built. And for being a fantasy writer, I hate world building. I complain about it a great deal. I love it when it's done. I love having a rich and vibrant world, but all of the pieces that go into putting that together are just no small feat. And I'm not that writer who will spend 3 years creating an entire guidebook to their world. I'm not that interested in it. I'm only interested in the world building insofar as what the characters are being impacted.
Mm.
So it's not as important to me to spend lots and lots of time with world building. So it ends up being a bit more of a chore.
I always think it's so funny when like authors are like, "Yeah, I'm kind of done with this book. Like I'm not feeling it anymore." You know, like when the series is like done or and then you have people who read it and they're like begging for more and so really into the world building and all the nitty-gritty details, you know?
Oh yeah, and I mean, as a reader, I absolutely love world building. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
I will revisit series and just immerse myself in that world and just get completely lost in all of the tiniest details. But as a writer, I tend to go to the school of philosophy, the school of that it should look like an old Hollywood set, and that it should to the reader look incredibly detailed and vibrant because all they're seeing is that set. They don't see the fact that it's scaffolding behind the set. It's
Mm.
only as deep as I want it to be for the focus of the story and for the journey of the characters.
Do you feel like that kind of approach saves you from like info dumping too much? If like, because I do feel like a lot of writers, when they, do all this world building and it is fully fleshed out, they feel the need to include all of it. And that kind of leads to moments of, well, now I need to like write you an essay when we were in the middle of like a fight or, whatever's going on.
Yeah, I actually have some strong opinions about that, and I do feel like that is a science fiction and fantasy writer's first mistake is that they fall so in love with their world building. They fall so in love with the world that they feel the need to explain it to their readers, and their readers are not in for that ride. Writers aren't J.R. Tolkien writing the appendices. They're writing, the Hobbit. That's where the focus should be. It should be on the story. It should be on the journey. It should be on the characters. Anytime that they feel the need to venture off of that, it tends to be in the form of an info dump. And suddenly you're getting a whole bunch of information that is detracting from the moment of the story that you're trying to tell. I tend not to info dump. I tend to avoid it. I don't want to say that I'm pretty good at it and then have a bunch of people go into my work and say, hey, Shoshana, you totally info dumped in this section. But I do make a strong effort to not info dump or to not spend a whole lot of time explaining things, which is why I think half of the people who have read this book have said that the world building is light, and the other half said it was hard to get into for a little while because I don't spend that time explaining it. I just let them learn about it as the characters reveal what's necessary for them to know. And that's generally how I approach things. I approach things from what does the character care about and move out from there.
What would you say is the hardest? What was the hardest thing about writing this book for you?
Oh goodness. So I think for me, the hardest thing was making sure that the romantic arcs were what I wanted them to be. Um, I will admit I'm a fantasy writer first and a romance author second. When I started by writing Journey, I was writing fantasy pretty exclusively. And this was before I was an indie author, obviously. Um, but I love romance. My all-time favorite fantasy book series is Kushiel's Legacy, which is heavy, heavy, heavy on the romance aspect of it. And it's kind of the standard I hold both fantasy and romance books to. I want that sort of love story and I want that sort of fantasy. Those are the two things that I love most encapsulated in one book. But for myself, I feel like learning how to write a romance is still a work in progress. I think I'm doing a pretty good job. I think that it comes off believable, but it's definitely the part that I have to go back and revise for every time because I'll be hurrying along with the plot that I have in my head and getting through it. And then I'll get to the point where the characters are having this big romantic moment. And I have to ask myself every single time, well, does this feel earned? And that's the
Hmm.
question I go back to every single time. And that's what always sends me back to the very beginning of the story and layering more and more and more romance as I go along. Even for the Desert Heiress, it's definitely, I'm calling it a fantasy romance. It's probably more of a romantasy. It's probably a fantasy first and a romance second. It definitely has pacing more like a traditional fantasy book than a romance book. The romance arcs are something that I definitely worked very hard on making sure were believable and earned by the time that they started to click in. Yeah, but it was definitely a struggle to make sure that they were all lining up properly, especially with, four of them or more going on at once.
Yeah, I love that you use the phrase "it does it feel earned" because like that's definitely the thing that I always shout at the TV like that's not earned. You can't do that because like the characters haven't had that on-screen time together. They haven't built that rapport. They haven't built enough trust in each other. Like those kinds of things. I watch a lot more fantasy than I read it. Sadly, I've seen. I think I've heard about Kushiel's Dart from you or from your social
Probably.
media posts more than anyone else. So I'm like,
Oh yeah, I'll talk about Kushiel's Dart a lot, especially since Cassiel's Servant came out this month, and I have been very self-indulgently reading both of them concurrently because Cassiel's Servant is a companion to Kushiel's Dart from the love interest point of view, and I've been very happily deep down that rabbit hole for the last week or two, enjoying every second of it. I did
do
warn
you,
people it would be my whole personality when it came out. So I,
you
I,
know,
I mean, I told them it was going to happen.
it's like, shut up! I'm not going to post about anything else. Don't expect anything else from me.
Exactly. Promote my own book? What? No, I'm going to talk about Cassiel's Servant.
No,
That's how
I'm
this is
done
going
with
to
that
work
thing.
out.
So I always feel like that is the big balancing act between like when you're reading a fantasy romance or romantasy or it will tend to veer one way or the other at like more heavily when focusing on building the romance or building the fantasy world and fantasy plot. You know, I don't think I've
Mm-hmm.
ever read or watched a piece of media that I felt like evenly distributed the two. Just
It's very hard, I think, to distribute the two, especially in what media is chosen to go on TV. Honestly, I mean, if you think about it, like Shadow and Bone's probably the one that comes up the most. It's not heavily romance. It does have a romantic element because it's YA and it has that element, but it's also a fantasy first with romantic subplot. It's not fantasy romance the way I I hate to bring up the big elephant in the room with fantasy romance, but of course ACOTAR is the main example. I actually haven't read it, so I'm not going to go down that path, but a lot of things that we're seeing in media for the most part are fantasy with maybe some romantic elements to them. I wouldn't call them even romantasy, and definitely not fantasy romance for the most part. So I think that also influences it. But it is a really hard balance to strike. And the question you always have to ask yourself when writing anything that is another genre first and romance second is, can you take the romance plot out and have the book survive? That is the question that you have to ask. And if it can, you haven't really gotten that balance between the two plots.
Mm.
Um, so if like Lise, for instance, could go through her whole attempted takeover journey without having the romance plot being part of it, it would be a straight fantasy, but she can't because her interactions with her rivals, her journey with her rivals are very much romantic leaning, and they'll get even more heavily romantic in the second book. So they are inseparable as far as those plots are, and that's the kind of level of intertwined you need, I think, to have a successful romantasy or fantasy romance.
I think that's a good way to like look at it. Like if you can successfully pull it out and isolate the romance, then it's not really fully permeating the rest of the story, you know?
Exactly. It has to take. I don't. I mean, it can take center stage. There's plenty of fantasy romance that is definitely romance first and fantasy second. Um, Mine is definitely fantasy first and romance second, if I had to classify those two. But it's still very close to 50-50. That's where it needs to be in that range. It could be maybe 55-45 or
Mm.
the other way around, but it still has to be pretty close to even in order to really hit that. Otherwise, it starts slipping out of that happy medium I think they have to be in.
This is you're self-published, right?
Right.
I want to make sure I interpreted you correctly when you spoke earlier. Do you have any traditional publishing experience or
Yes, I do have some traditional publishing experience. I am not published traditionally. I do have an agent under a different pen name, which I won't go into because I try to keep them separate. But I have gone through the whole traditional clearing. I've written books to get traditionally published. And of course, now I have published self as well.
well, I would love to know maybe in a different episode more on like your thoughts on the two what it's like to kind of handle those two different careers and the differences you're seeing firsthand, you know. That would
Mm-hmm.
I think that would be a really interesting topic, but I don't want to distract too much
Yeah,
direction
that
right
can
now.
easily be its own episode, I think.
Yeah, no, I think like that could be its whole like a whole thing. Like, oh, okay, just gonna like put a pin in this thought, but like not forget about it. When you go the self pub route, I think there's definitely every book is kind of a step in the learning curve, and
Mm-hmm.
every book you kind of learn more. I think there's like such an intense pressure on the first book to like when you're like first starting out on your journey, like make the first book perfect and like do everything right the first time. But like obviously you don't know what you need to know, so you're gonna miss some things the first time around. So all this lead up is to say like what do you feel like you've got right on you know each step of the way, that like what have you really built on, or things that you
Oh,
did differently with this book as opposed to maybe your first and second.
it's definitely been a journey. I knew absolutely nothing when I published Stripes Apple, which is hilarious because I thought I knew so much because I'd spent so much time as an observer of the indie process and talking to indie authors that I thought I knew what I was doing. And of course, that was my own hubris talking. I knew absolutely nothing about how to market a book, how to build up that presence and get what I needed in order to successfully launch a book. And I think Stripes Apple has been hurting for that ever since. It was launched a year ago and a couple of weeks now. It's never taken off the way that I hoped for. And you're absolutely right. We put a lot of pressure on ourselves to be that huge success right out of the gate. But talking to authors who are a lot more experienced than I am, I've kind of tried to reframe that in that this first series is just for practice.
Okay, I love that.
Yeah, it's
I think we really need more of that kind of a mindset, you know?
yes, and admittedly, it's been a painful road getting to that mindset. I definitely had higher hopes for this book than actually have materialized.
No,
But
absolutely. You want the moon every time, but like,
yeah, you want to be that magical TikTok viral, suddenly selling 5 million copies sort of person. But
yeah.
let's be honest, 99% of us are not that. 99% of us are need to do things the old-fashioned way, which is just to keep putting out books.
Yeah, building your backlog.
Exactly. I think the main things that I took away from Strife's Apple and Oblivion's River is they were not as to market as I would have hoped they were. And I think this is part of the fact that they're not easily placed in a market because, I mean, like I said, they are kind of urban fantasy, but I mean, they're totally focused on gods. There's no mortals at all in my story. It's probably spicier than a lot of urban fantasy readers prefer. They tend to be, from what I understand anyway, and have been told, they tend to be a little lower heat than those books are. And just finding their audience has always been tricky. It's not that I haven't tried. I have done literally everything that I could afford to do for those books.
Hmm.
The other thing is, of course, and this is something I wish I had learned before I put out book two, is that book two in a series tends to not do as well as we would expect. And my book two flopped pretty heavily. From what I understand, that's pretty normal, is to have a book two not perform as well as book one and then to have things rebound when book three is out.
Really? That's so interesting. This is the first time I'm learning about this. So,
This is what this is what people who are a lot more experienced than me have been telling me. The common wisdom that I've heard is that you hit real success with a series when the third book comes out, especially if that makes that series complete, because of course being able to advertise a completed series is a huge leg up, because all of the readers who have maybe held off on reading it because they didn't want to be disappointed if it wasn't complete, or they didn't want to wait because cliffhangers, although these are interconnected standalones, so there's no cliffhangers anywhere. Those fears get allayed and readers will go through and read all three at once. So this is something I'm hoping for when my third book, Invoking Ruin, comes out, which I'm hoping will be the beginning of the year, but we'll see. But yeah, the things that I most had to learn is that I needed to find a market that had a more voracious readership. I needed to find better ways to market this book, to include more of the things that people are attracted to in a book, even though they weren't necessarily my first instinct to include. And I'm talking about like those universal fantasy sort of tropes that, well, not tropes, but universal fantasies that readers really enjoy. I wanted to make sure that I was doing a better job at highlighting those, especially in my marketing. I picked a why choose because I do love why choose. It's one of my favorite things, but I also thought that it would be easier to find readers in a why choose, which has so far been absolutely true. Um, just a lot of things that I took as part of my mental calculus when I decided to pivot after Oblivion's River was, can I put out a series that is much easier for me to find and reach readers with? And that was kind of how I went into writing and especially promoting The Desert Heiress.
I didn't realize it wasn't a duology at first, honestly. I thought it was like my mind is always like things are linear and like so I wasn't thinking that you were doing two different series concurrently. Does that make sense? Like you're
No,
writing a book of each at the same not necessarily at the same time, but they're kind of overlapping.
right. And admittedly, that wasn't my original intention. My original intention was to write all three books and be done with it. But I got to the end of Oblivion's River, and like I said, Oblivion's River did not perform nearly as well as I would have hoped. And I was just burnt out on the series at that point. I was burnt out on having to go straight from writing one book to the next book to the next book. And I was like, for my own mental health and for my own viability as an author, I needed to pivot and put Invoking Ruin on the back burner temporarily and do something else. And I think it was really helpful for me, um, not just for my career, but just for me personally, being able to shift into something entirely different and get some space, uh, really helped me just be able to enjoy writing again and enjoy what I was doing and to just put forward the best story that I possibly could rather than persisting on something that wasn't at that moment bringing me joy.
I like it. I think following your joy is something that kind of goes under discussed in writing circles. Does that make sense? Like to me, the main point of romance is to follow your joy. Does that like that does that feel
Yeah, I think both those things are true. That romance is about finding joy, and that finding joy as an author is something that is probably under discussed. Because, and this is especially true, I think, in indie, is that so much of it has been kind of overtaken by the idea of hustle culture, with
oh
the idea of
absolutely.
rapid releasing, with the idea of just making sure you're putting forward the next book, the next book, the next book. And those things are important because again, you have to build a backlist. For most of us, we are not going to hit it in one book. What's going to happen is that we're going to have a backlist and one of those books is going to eventually pop off and readers are going to go back and read everything else. And that's where it all starts to pay off, or at least that's the hope, the dream. But getting there can be a really deep slog if you're not enjoying what you are writing. And I think being able to pivot creatively, even if it means slowing down the finished series part of the process, was really important for me to be able to keep doing what I'm doing.
So you've talked about I don't want to call it writing to market because that's not quite what it is, but it's a little bit like you talked about incorporating tropes that readers like, looking for a more voracious audience, sort of things that I think that not like those are steps that are practical from a business position and can be difficult to kind of commit yourself to in like a creative way. Obviously you're choosing ones that appeal most to you. uh, you're not just
Mm-hmm.
writing to market and writing like what you hear is popular. I'm not trying to imply that. I'm you know there because there is a vast amount of stuff out there that is popular, and you can have your pick of like these are the things that are popular but also appeal to you, and you think they'll be a good bet. You write about this will pay off, which the book of your heart may not necessarily always do.
Yeah, and I think that is absolutely true. But I think it's also something that's true, no matter how you want to sell your book, whether it is self-publishing and going directly to readers, or it is through traditional means and going through an agent and going through submission. There is a certain degree always of writing to market. It's just what writing to market means can sometimes look a little different. Um,
Absolutely.
no, I'm sorry. I'm trying to get around to it. I think I just went off on my own tangent there,
No, you're good.
but I think that there has to be some sort of practical concern to when you're writing. I think it can't just be the book of your heart. To be fair, I am very bad at not writing the book of my heart every single time. These are
No,
all,
absolutely. I think it's such a if someone has managed to write a book to more towards the market than the book of their heart or whatever, that is such a demonstration of like emotional fortitude to me. Like it's like, oof, I could not. you know?
yeah, no, and I think I don't think anyone. Well, that's not true. I've definitely talked to authors who can absolutely just write purely to market and write with that sort of bent. I'm not one of them, but I do think to a certain degree that being able to identify what is working, especially within your own writing, and what is appealing to people and what isn't, and making adjustments accordingly is just a natural progression as part
Absolutely.
of developing yourself as a writer and as an author with a brand. Because I
Hmm.
think where it branches out from that is, what is your branding? What are you bringing to readers that they can expect from you every time? If I had to ask myself that question, it would be very messy heroines. All of them are disasters. It's pretty consistent. Messy heroines, messy family dynamics are pretty consistent. And just a certain amount of moral grayness. I think it's not morally gray in the everyone's a villain and doing terrible things, but it's more of a morally gray in the I leave the black and whiteness of any sort of morality that might exist in this world, whether that is stemming from purity culture or not, at the door. I tend to just not ask those sorts of questions in my writing. I tend to frame it in, what is the best choice for this character at the time, and not, is this the morally correct thing for the character to do. I don't concern myself with that. So that's more of what I mean with like moral grayness. But I think having a consistent brand so that readers, even if you have made a pivot into something entirely different, like I have, and I mean, eventually I'm going to make some pivots into like contemporary or historical fantasy. I don't plan on staying in one thing forever,
Hmm.
or even a very long time. I want to do lots of things, but I think having a certain consistency in what readers can expect, no matter what type of book of mine they are picking up, is the sort of branding and writing to market that I think all authors should consider. What are the things that readers expect out of you, and how do you deliver that to your readers?
I think you kind of answered the question that I was rooting around for without like being able to get to it, especially when you started talking about author brand. And so I think my last kind of question is, when you look at what your author brand has become in your pivots, do you see it as being all that different from like what you like originally may have set out for before you learned all the things that you have in this process?
In terms of my writing, I think it's still pretty consistent. In terms of my marketing and how I call attention to it, I think that has been the bigger change, because my ability to market Stripes Apple was non-existent. I had no idea what I was doing. And even with Oblivion's River, I think I was still learning. And of course, I'm still learning with The Desert Heiress. But one of the things I sat down is, after I wrote the book, is I asked myself, what are the actual tropes that I put in there? Because I generally don't write a book with tropes in mind. They just kind of happen. But I asked myself what they were. I asked myself what sort of universal fantasies I had. And then like, I went looking for the pull quotes that best highlighted those aspects of the book. I also worked on making sure that blurb, everything about that book called to what I wanted readers to get out of it. And I mean, I wouldn't say I think I've done a perfect job of that, of course, but I think the response to this book being so much more than what I ever could have gotten out of Stripes Apple speaks to the fact that this is, you know, another step on the journey, and that I have learned from a year ago for certain.
Well, I'm really glad that you're seeing the growth that you want to see. More of it, maybe not all of it, you know. Can't have it all at once.
No,
Uh
can't have it all at once. And I mean, I don't, it's still small growth. I'm not going to say that I'm this huge success. I most certainly am not. But
no, but I'm glad
certain,
you are on the growing path.
yes,
Like,
that makes sense. That's how I would characterize it. I am on the growing path, and I'm seeing progress in the direction I want to see it.
I'm glad, and I hope to see you get, you know, even bigger as an author. And we usually leave our audience with a bit of writing advice to chew on. Do you, if you had to quantify, whatever your current writing dilemma or experience or an answer that you've figured out for yourself recently that you would like to impart us with, impart to us. God, I wish I could edit my, the jumble of words that just fall out of my mouth.
Oh, don't we all wish that? I think the writing wisdom, and this is the writing wisdom that I give everybody, is that you have to be willing to completely tear your work apart, no matter what. You can't hold on to it forever. You have to be able to look at your work and say to yourself, really sometimes harshly even, is this working or is it not? Is it actually advancing the goals of the story? And if it's not, you have to be willing to cut it. But conversely, you can't revise forever. You have to revise with a goal in mind. And it's one thing if you're saying, I didn't do everything in that revision I wanted to. There are still some things I need to go back and fix with a concrete idea of what those things are. But if you are just keep going back and revising and revising for revising's sake, you're never going to get over the finish line. And at some point, the book needs to either get queried or it needs to get published, whichever road you want to take it down, but you have to move on to that next step, or it's just going to keep you in a cycle forever. And eventually your writing will outgrow the book and you will not be able to pull that book to where you are as a writer, and you have to let it go.
Yeah, because every book, you are constantly reading and writing and learning, and at some point your writing will not be the same quality it was, and you may not be the same person with the same opinions and perspectives as you were when you started the book.
Absolutely. And every book, I think, has a shelf life as far as usefulness to the writer. And you don't want it to, you don't want it to go outside of that shelf life. You don't want it to keep something that is expired. You want to be able to move on to something new.
Yeah, and at some point you just have to, because ideally you would, by the time you finish a book and move on to the next one, you're not going to have to repeat that entire process of revising for years and years and years, It has to be sustainable.
Yeah, every book you should, I don't want to say should because some books are going to be harder than others, but ideally you're going to get faster at this every time you complete a book. It took me absolute years to sit down and actually finish a book. And then each book I have written since, I have done a little bit faster and a little bit faster and a little bit faster. Because you learn more, you inherently understand structure more, you inherently understand character arc more, you get more and more of an innate sense of how these things are put together, and the best way to become a better writer is to keep writing and keep practicing, and that part of that means moving on to the next thing.
All right, well, where can people find you, your books, and anything else you want to plug?
Again, thank you for listening. I'm Shoshana Rain. You can find my books on Kindle Unlimited, and on paperback. You can find me most consistently on Instagram. And I think that's about it.
Okay, well, I will be seeing you around then on Instagram.
Yeah.
All the places. Listener, you can find me at by Kate Pryor on Threads, Instagram, TikTok. I believe that's all for this week. Go read Shoshana's books. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. All right. Bye, listener. Bye.